Hello and welcome to Encounter Church's first service of 2021. If this is your first time tuning in, my name's Joel. I'm the lead pastor here, and we're really glad that you're joining us for worship. Before we begin, just want to wish everybody a very happy new year. I think that we are all collectively ready for 2020 to end, and we're so glad to welcome in the new year with all of the new possibilities that the year offers, right? And it's great to start that by seeking God and spending some time worshiping God. If you're part of our congregation, we're doing things a little bit different now. We're gonna try switching things up a little bit. So we're gonna have our message first and dive into God's word, and then we'll have some time to worship towards the end of the video. So when the message is on, don't go anywhere. Stay and take some time to worship God and seek His presence. With that, I want you to pray with me as we begin our service. Dear God, we thank you so much for the blessing of your faithfulness. That in the midst of such a difficult year where so many people suffered in some very profound real ways, you've also sustained us, and you've also provided for us, and you've also kept us. And as we enter this new year, God, we want to be grateful for that and honor you for that and ask for your blessing for the new year that's ahead. Ask for your presence to be with us as we face the things that come our way in this new year. In the name of your Son, we pray. Amen. Usually, the sermons at the beginning of the year are when pastors are trying to be super encouraging, right? Like a lot of messages at this time last year were Vision 2020, which I found a little cheesy, to be honest with you. And people saying, "Hey, this year is going to be your year, and it's time to expand, to conquer," things like that, right? And little did we know what the year actually had in store for us, right? And I don't want to sound like I'm blaming these pastors or saying that they were lying or faking things. I think that we look at the scriptures and we see the promises of God, and we try to believe these things in faith and try to give people a word of encouragement. And let's be honest, if you had come to our church first Sunday last year and I had gone on stage and told you what was about to happen, A, you probably wouldn't have believed me, and B, you probably would have left and never come back, and you would say, "That guy is like a bum. It's a bummer, and he's just depressing us, and he's talking crazy stuff," right? And yet here we are. Like, nobody could have prepared or predicted what's going to happen. Of the many words that we could use to describe 2020, unpredictable is probably at the top of the list. It was a year that we couldn't prepare for. And I think that's interesting because usually at the beginning of a year is when we try to prepare for the year ahead, right? And you'll see people making resolutions of things that they want to achieve, and people making plans and people setting goals. I know people that kind of like try to visualize themselves at the end of the year, thinking, how things are going to end up, and, set things in motion to accomplish that. And the thing that last year revealed to us is that a lot of the things that we believe we have control over, we actually don't. I feel like so much of the collective anxiety and trauma that we've experienced in 2020 is precisely that, the lack of control, the idea that you really don't know what's around the corner, and that can be scary and that can be paralyzing. And some of you are listening to this and you're saying, no, Joe, listen to me. You have control over your own life, and you can decide that you're going to do what, you put in your heart to do, and you can take action and you can take steps, and you shouldn't, go into a victim mentality about what's going to happen. And I think that to a certain degree, you'll be right. I think that we're responsible for how we react to things. We're responsible for the things that we do. But the thing that last year showed us is that we actually have no control over our external circumstances. And we might think that we can overpower that. We might think that, hey, if I work hard and if I plan ahead, I'm going to be able to, get ahead of the situation. And yet I've seen business after business close, and church after church close, of people that work really hard and try to plan ahead and try to get ahead of the situation, and still wasn't enough. Like, we've learned that there's a level to which we cannot control our external circumstances. And now there's people that what they would do is that they would kind of like say, what's the point? They would fall into apathy. What's the point of trying to plan? What's the point of trying to prepare? What's the point of setting goals or anything if we have no control over the future? The worst case of that is not only apathy, but hopelessness. That you look at a year like the one we just had, with all of its pain and all of its sorrow and all of its heartbreak, and our posture starts twisting into a posture of hopelessness that thinks that everything is just going to continuously keep getting worse and worse and worse, and we fall into depression and fear and anxiety. And I'm telling you this because I've struggled with how to properly approach a new year. What's the point of telling people, hey, let's plan for this and let's have this vision if, we don't know what's going to happen as a church? We have a new year ahead of us full of challenges and things we want to accomplish. How do we approach that, without deluding ourselves into a control of a circumstance that we probably don't have? But also, how do we do this without falling into apathy or even worse, into hopelessness? And I think there's a passage in the scriptures that sheds some light into that. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to open it to the book of Numbers. And Numbers chapter 9, I'm going to start reading on verse 15. And this is what Numbers chapter 9, verse 15 says. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law, was set up, and the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained encamped. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. When the people of Israel get out of Egypt and go into the desert and start wandering in the desert, one of the things one of the first things that God tells them to do is to build a tabernacle. A tabernacle, it's basically a mobile temple. It's a tent. It's a tent that was kind of to represent the presence of God, and it functioned like a temple before the temple was built. And they would build it kind of like in the middle of the camp, and everybody would kind of like camp around it. And this story is kind of like the first time the tabernacle is finished being built, and they set it up. And if you read a little bit before, what you will see is that when the people of Israel were wandering in the desert, the presence of God would go ahead of them in the form of this cloud. And then when it turned dark, then that cloud would turn into like this pillar of fire, and that's how they would kind of like follow around, move around in the desert. And that cloud in this passage goes and starts like floating over the tabernacle and resting there. And what I find so interesting about this story is that this cloud that represents the presence of God actually is what determines when the Israelites would move or not move, and how long the Israelites would be camping and not camping. Everything was like the control over the life of Israel was entrusted into this cloud that represented the presence of God. It's interesting that the same thing happened with how the people of Israel would eat in the desert. Well, they were in the desert, the way they were fed, according to the story, is that this manna, it's something that would fall from the sky. It's kind of like almost like this like cereal, almost like these flakes that were sweet. And in the morning, they would wake up and they would see these flakes and they would eat it. They would eat the manna. And then at night, this quail would kind of like fall from the sky and they would eat that. And one of the things that you read in the story is that they could only keep enough for that day. And if they kept more than they needed for the one day, and the next day they would go check out what they had kept, and it would have rotten, so that they could learn to trust that God was going to provide for them day by day. They learned to depend on God for their sustenance. And I'm sharing with you this story because I believe that this story gives us a window into how we should approach the future. Precisely how we can approach future that's uncertain, right? Because you see, a lot of us think about uncertainty in these two terms, right? What we can control and we can't control. And we think about us, and we think about the plans that we make, and we think about the strategies that we make, and those are things that we can control. And then we think about our circumstances and the things that are outside of our control. And depending where you fall in the spectrum, you're either thinking that you can overpower your circumstances, or you're a victim of them, or you're surrendered to your circumstances because there's nothing that you can do about them. And the interesting thing is that in this story, there's a third factor playing in the midst. It's not only the Israelites, and it's not only the external circumstances, whether that is the people of Egypt, or the weather in the desert, or the foreign enemies that they would meet while they were there. But the other element that's present is the presence of God, is God. You see, the people of Israel had very little control over their lives. They acknowledged that. But that didn't mean that they were just victims of circumstance. It meant that the control of their life had been entrusted and had been given to God. And I think that dynamic of the people of Israel, that of surrendering control of their lives to the will of God, can actually be the key of how we can face an uncertain future. Yes, it's true that, this year has exposed that we have so very little control over our external circumstances. But guess what? We never really did. It's not like we had control over pandemics before 2020, and then when 2020 hit, we stopped having control. We never had control over pandemics. We just weren't exposed to one. It's not that before 2020 we didn't have control over the economy, and when 2020 hit, we didn't have control over it. No, we never had control over the economy. We have very little control over our own lives. But the way in which we respond to that is not by doubling down on our own strength and thinking, you know what, I'm going to master whatever, circumstances come my way and whatever adversities, because I'm strong and I'm good and I can do this. And it's also not just being paralyzed by fear or anxiety that there's nothing that we can do. What the people of Israel do is, listen, we're in the desert and we're easy targets to the weather, to the elements, to foreign enemies. And there's nothing we can do on our own. But God is guiding us. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our lives around following God and trusting in God. Surrendering control is not giving up. It's actually, if you think about it, kind of like being consistent with reality. If it's true that we are in very little control about the things that happen around us, then instead of just making plans that don't take into account and setting objectives that we think that we can do in our own strength, what would happen if we think, no, what if we surrender the control of our lives to God? What if we recognize that even if we don't have control of the world, that God does? The people of Israel believed that. The people of Israel believed that God was kind of like guiding history, guiding the world towards a positive, beautiful, redemptive future. And if that they trusted Him, they were going to be okay. So just to kind of give you a couple of practical things. What does that look like? How do we surrender control and embrace faith? There's a couple of things. Number one is the people of Israel organized their lives around the presence of God. In the story, this is very depicted in a very physical way, because the tabernacle is at the center of the camp of the Israelites. And the cloud that represented the presence of God is over the tabernacle. So it's not like everybody's camping, facing the tabernacle, looking day and night at the presence of God. And that's important because remember this, what we read, right? It says that they didn't know how long they were going to be camping in a place. They could be camping for a day, they could be camping for a week, they could be camping for a year. And yet, what determined when they were moving was not the plans that they would make, was not the plans that Moses would make, was not the plans that Aaron would make. What determined when they were moving was what? Was when the cloud moved. They followed the cloud. And I think that there's something to learn there for us, that if the one thing that we did this year, besides whatever plans we do, besides whatever resolutions, is to organize our lives around the presence of God, the guidance that we need, the wisdom that we need, the direction that we need to make it through this year is going to make itself known to us, because we're following the Spirit, because we're following the cloud, because we're following the presence of God. But the only way in which that happens is what? When you organize your life around the presence of God. For Israel, that meant very physically, like camping, and every day when they wake up, they will look at it. But for you and for me, that looks different. Maybe it looks like making God a priority in our lives, making spiritual disciplines a priority. You know that a lot of times I feel that when I'm trying to engage in spiritual disciplines, that I'm wasting my time. That if I slept in a little bit, or if I have a busy day, then the last thing that I have time for is to seek God, right? So it kind of gets pushed off the calendar because I have more important things to do. But if this is true, if it's ultimately God the one who guides the world, God the one who's in control, what can be more important than spending time in the presence of God? Because the guidance and the wisdom that we need to face the day, to face the year, is found there. The second thing is, I don't think that this means that we have to give up on planning, but it does mean that we have to let go of the outcomes of our plans. If you read, the Torah, the people of Israel make a lot of plans. Like the book of Numbers, the book of counting how many people they have, how many tribes, all sorts of things. Why? Because they needed to plan to survive in the desert for 40 years. They made plans about all sorts of things. So this is not a message that you shouldn't plan for the future. Directly the opposite. Dwight Eisenhower is famous for saying, in preparing for battle, I found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So we need to plan. But we hold those plans very loosely. Why? Because we know that we're not in control. We know that things can change. And we know that when God is in control, a lot of times God will do things that we don't expect. There's this proverb that says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And what this does is that it liberates us from the burden of having to control the outcome of our plans. But it also opens up to the new thing that God might be doing. I found this to be true in starting a church. That when we started our church, even before then, we had all sorts of plans and objectives and things we wanted to do, and we tried to do them to the best of our ability. And there were outcomes that we thought that were going to happen out of those things. And sometimes those outcomes happened, sometimes they didn't. And we had to learn to trust that ultimately, under whatever efforts we're doing or whatever plans we're making, that God was guiding our lives, even if that didn't look the way that we expected. And when you let go of that, when you let go of the need to control the outcomes, you are liberated of anxiety and guilt and fear and can embrace life with a deeper sense of peace. The final thing is this: receive God's provision for today. You see, a big part of the issue that happens at the beginning of the year is that we start, planning ahead, and we plan for the year. And we plan for the year, and we have all these goals and all these things that we want to accomplish and all these things we want to do. And we spend so much time thinking in the long term that we fail to think about the now in two different ways. One is that we fail to realize how many of the things that we do today impact tomorrow. That it's the decisions that we do today, the things that we do today, that really shape what happens after. But it's also the fact that we fail to see how God is doing something for us today. Is providing for us today. In the story of Israel, there's these two things, right? One is that they surrender control of how long they're going to camp. And I can imagine that being incredibly unnerving, right? And it can make you full of anxiety. You're like, how long are we going to be here, right? Are we going to be here for a week? Are we going to be here for 2 months? We don't know. And I've often wondered, what's the thing that sustained them through that time? And I actually think that the answer is the story of how they were provided food. That every day, when they woke up, there was manna. And every day, every evening, when it got dark, quail fell over the desert. That day after day, God proved to them faithful. And the fact that they were seeing God's faithfulness in their life day after day gave them the hope that they needed to endure the uncertainty of not knowing how long they were going to be camped in a place. I think that probably one of the best things that we can do as we face this new year is to start seeing the things that God is doing in our lives today. How God is moving in our lives today. How God is providing for us today. How God is loving us today. When we see that, when we're filled with the gratitude of the things that God has provided for us today, we can face the uncertainty of tomorrow. We can face the uncertainty of next week, the uncertainty of next month, because day after day, we're being reminded of the mercies of God. Many years after the Israelites entered the Promised Land, the author of the Book of Lamentations writes this. He says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." I love that idea that God's mercies are new every morning. I wonder if that concept developed in the Jewish imagination during their wandering in the desert, when they had to trust every morning there was going to be manna for them, sustenance for that day, new mercy. And as I'm thinking about the year that we have ahead, where so much is unknown, we hope it's a good year, right? We hope it's a better year. Really hope it's a better year than last year. I long for that. But whatever plans or goals we might have, the one thing is that we have no control over the future, that we don't know what's going to happen. And in that reality, we have to be more and more comfortable with the lack of control. Not as an act of apathy, but as an act of faith. A faith that God will continue to do what only He can do. That He will continue to provide what we need and move in all the ways in which we need Him to move. And we have the faith that there will be manna every morning and quail every evening. And that the cloud will continue to guide us. Faith that there's new mercies of God every morning. As a church, we want to be able to face a future like that, with that type of faith. So my invitation for you, you're watching this today, is to let go of the need to control the outcomes of your plans. To become comfortable with the idea that there's so very little you have control over. Not because you're pathetic, not because you're a victim, not because you're hopeless. Because now you're resting in the fact that God is the one who guides history. And as you trust in Him, that God is the one who guides your life. May God guide our lives this year as a church and individually. Grace and peace.
This is my prayer in the desert, when all that's within me feels dry. This is my prayer in my hunger and need. My God is the God who provides. This is my prayer in the fire, in weakness or trial or pain. Her is a faith proved of more worth than gold. So refine me, Lord, through the flame. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He and triumph is still on its way. I am a conqueror, co-heir with Christ, so firm on his promise I stand. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and he is here. You are here. All of my life, in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. Sing all of my life. All of my life, in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. All of my life, in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and he is here. This is my prayer in the harvest, when favor and providence flow. I know I'm filled to be emptied again. The seed I've received, I will sow.
I'm leaning on the everlasting arms that place me on the rock that stands. I hold true to the one who breaks my fall and lifts me time and time again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. This freedom purchased by the highest price, this grace outweighing all my shame. I'm made new through the power of sacrifice, from death now raised to life again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Yeah, your love. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good, buried with Christ what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good. You never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good. You never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing. You are good. Bury the price and rise in your freedom. You are good. You make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. Yes, you are.
Hey Connor, a couple things. If this is your first time tuning in, we're really glad that you're worshiping with us today and we'd love to connect with you. So we actually have a digital connection card. There should be a link on the description of this video, or you can just go to encounterec.com/connect. It's just a short form with a couple questions. Just answer however much you feel comfortable with. But it's a way for us to know that you visited, that you tuned in. And also, we would like to reach out. We have a little gift for you, and we like to set up some money aside for every new connection card that we get to help our community. So by filling one out, you're actually, doing some good in our neighborhood and our community. Couple more things. Our goal, as we've been, teasing out through the last few months, is to this year, as early as possible, be able to go back to meeting in person. We're not sure that would be probably likely in our current location because of the size restrictions there. And we are, considering a couple of different options. We're hoping to have an answer for you about, when we're going to go back to having in-person meetings very soon. So just stay tuned. For the time being, we're going to be continue doing this online, but I'm hoping that in the next few weeks, I'm going to be able to have an answer for you. Hey, this is your new place, and this one we're going to start meeting in person, and I'm really excited for that. Finally, I just want to thank again everybody that's been so faithfully giving to Encounter. Your gift has helped our church sustain us through a very difficult and uncertain 2020, and it's a win which God has provided for us. So we're grateful for that. If you would like to give to the mission of Encounter, you can do that at encounterec.com/give, or there should be a link on the description for this video. Finally, I would like to close this with a word of benediction. My brothers and sisters of Encounter, may you know when life becomes uncertain, when you don't know what's going to happen, when you don't know what's coming next. May you learn to trust in God. May you learn to trust that God is the one who's in control, that God is the one who's guiding history and taking history to a redemptive place. May you learn to surrender control and embrace faith. May grace and peace be with you. See you next week.